Okay, I want to talk now a little bit about the war in Europe and Africa. In the spring of 1942, the German armies were consolidating their positions in France and North Africa. Nowhere were things going well for the Allies. American military leaders and Stalin in the Soviet Union wanted to bring the war directly to Hitler with an invasion in Europe. But cooler British heads prevailed, convincing President Roosevelt that the Allies were not ready for such a major undertaking in the face of Hitler's superior forces. Still, the Allies had to do something in order to recover the initiative. Winston Churchill proposed an invasion of French North Africa in order to take the pressure off British forces in Egypt. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, commanding the elite German Africa Corps, was heading toward the Suez, the loss of which would be extremely serious for the Allies. Churchill believed an Allied invasion would also have the secondary benefit of drawing German forces away from the beaches of Europe to Africa. Once there, they could not be easily returned to the continent because of increasing Allied control of the Mediterranean Sea area. Let me talk about the first major Allied offensive, I guess. It was Operation Torch, which was planned for 8 November 1942. It really became the first Allied offensive operation against the Axis in the European North African theater. American amphibious forces making up the Western Naval Task Force were to come from East Coast ports and converge on French Morocco. They were to land on 3 beaches near the primary objective, that being the port of Casablanca. Now, combined British and American forces making up the Central Naval Task Force would invade Oran in Algeria. A third combined contingent, called the Eastern Naval Task Force, would seize Algiers. Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme commander, and Admiral Kent Hewitt, U.S. Navy, was the amphibious task force commander. The big question mark of Operation Torch concerned the Vichy French forces in the area. Would they resist the landings? The invasion thus became a political problem as well as a military one. If the French decided to offer serious resistance, they might well be able to hold off the Allies until German reinforcements arrived. This could doom the invasion and set up a major disaster for the Allies in North Africa. I'm going to read a few things that aren't specifically in the notes but are here in the slides. General Mark Clark, he landed secretly in Algeria from a submarine to persuade the Vichy French authorities to support those Allied landings. French General Giraud was rescued from Vichy France and brought to Algeria to transition local French armed forces from Vichy loyalty to that Free French that de Gaulle was helping out with. All right. Now, as it turned out, the French Navy and some shore batteries put up a spirited defense at Casablanca. This was quickly eliminated, however, by U.S. Navy gunfire. Little resistance was met in either Oran or Algiers. The French quickly surrendered and joined forces with de Gaulle's Free French, in accordance with secret orders from Marshal Pétain, the French leader in Vichy. Now, in response, Hitler's armies immediately occupied any previously unoccupied parts of France. Operation Torch, though anything but smooth, was completely successful in meeting all of its objectives. It showed, however, that the Allies were by no means ready to invade Hitler's Europe. Much more training, larger forces, and better equipment would be necessary. I'm going to talk a little bit about Field Marshal Montgomery here. He's the guy who led the British 8th Army in Egypt, defeated Rommel's Africa Corps at El Alamein, and eventually removed the threat to the Suez. Okay. The North African operation set up one of the first major defeats for the Axis. Shortly before the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army routed the Africa Corps at El Alamein, thus removing that threat to the Suez. Now, the Allies then squeezed the Germans and Italians between them into Tunisia, and in May, the fighting in North Africa ended with the defeat and capture of the entire Africa Corps, about 275,000 troops and all of their remaining equipment. Meanwhile, Rommel escaped to Germany in the closing days of the campaign. As an indirect result of the Allied victory in Africa, most of the main units of the Vichy French naval fleet were subsequently scuttled at Toulon. Remember, we talked about scuttling whenever they basically destroyed it in place. Okay, we talk just real briefly about the Eastern Front. In the winter of 1942-1943, the Soviets had surrounded and defeated an entire German army at Stalingrad, which is an industrial city on the Volga River. They took 330,000 prisoners in one of history's most savage battles. The Battle of Stalingrad turned the tide on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet advance that had begun in February of 1943 did not stop until the Red Army entered the German capital of Berlin 2 years later. In January 1943, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill met in the famous Casablanca Conference. They decided that before any major offensives were to succeed elsewhere, anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic had to be given top priority. This was when merchant shipping losses along the U.S. East Coast were at their peak. Second, the Allied leaders agreed that the next offensive operation against the Axis would be an invasion of Sicily in July. The Mediterranean sea lanes were now reasonably secure except from land-based air attack. Finally, the leaders announced that the Allies would demand nothing short of the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Unconditional surrender meaning that it's not limited by any conditions, it's simply absolute surrender. Okay?